There's a statue in Denmark, in Copenhagen harbor, of a black woman sitting on a throne. The statue is 7 meters tall. The woman she depicts is not Danish. She's from a small Caribbean island called St. Croix, and she's there because of something she did to Denmark, not for it. Let's go to St. Croix in the year 1878. At that time, the island belonged to Denmark, and by then had belonged to this Nordic country for over 150 years. Now, most people, when they think of Caribbean colonizers, think of the British, the French, the Dutch, or the Spanish. Denmark doesn't often come up. But Denmark ran plantations too, and the Danish enslaved people as well. Our story starts the 1st of October in 1878, and in the town of Frederiksted, where on the western end of St. Croix there is a crowd. There's rum moving through it and music behind it, because today is a special day. It's the one day out of the whole year when the people who work the plantations here are allowed to gather like this and actually be heard. We'll get to why that matters in a moment. Now, some of the crowd is getting loud, and the police decide that they've seen enough. They move into the crowd to break it up, and then things escalate. A farm laborer named Henry Trotman ends up beaten badly enough to have to be carried off to the hospital. Henry hasn't done anything wrong specifically. He's simply in the crowd when the police decide the whole gathering needs to be shut down. And he's the one who pays for that. Now, immediately, a rumor starts moving through the crowd, and it moves like lightning. Trotman is dead, is what people are saying, killed by the police. On the one day of the year that is supposed to be theirs. It's not actually true, and Trotman is really very much alive. But then someone lights a torch, and then things start moving at lightning speed. The police and soldiers who had waded into the crowd retreat into a stone fort in Frederiksted called Fort Frederick, and they barricade themselves inside. A rider is sent racing across the island to the other main town, Christiansted, to call for reinforcements. Outside the fort's walls, Frederiksted starts to burn. And it doesn't stop there. Over the 2 weeks that follow, something like 50 plantations across the island are destroyed, and close to 900 acres of sugarcane land is burned to the ground. On the 4th day, warships from Britain, France, and the United States arrive offshore, offering to help the Danish authorities put the insurrection down. The Danish governor, a man named Janus Garde, turns them away, confident that his own men can handle it. The next day, he issues an order. Any laborer not back on their plantation will be declared a rebel. Now, how does one rumor about one man turn into weeks of an island on fire? To answer that, we have to go back to 1848, the year slavery was abolished on this island. And we have to understand what freedom actually came to mean here in the 30 years after that. So yeah, slavery had ended, but freedom in this particular colony had a shape that felt a lot like a cage. In 1848, the enslaved people of St. Croix forced the issue themselves. Thousands of them gathered at Fort Frederick and gave the Danish governor an ultimatum: free everyone by noon or watch Frederiksted burn. The governor, a man named Peter von Scholte, was outnumbered and cut off from help. And he knew what had happened in Haiti a few decades earlier when a colony ignored a warning like this one. So he gave the crowd what they were asking for. He declared right then that slavery was over, immediately. It cost him everything. He had acted without permission from the king back in Denmark, and for that he was recalled home and put on trial. But the declaration held. Victory. But what tends to be forgotten when people tell the victory story is that within a year, the plantation owners and the colonial government had built a new system that replaced the old one quite effectively. And that new system was designed so carefully that it barely counted as freedom at all. It was called the Labor Act. Under this law, every worker had to sign a yearly contract to work a specific plantation. Wages were fixed by the government, so there was no negotiating that. And you couldn't quit whenever you wanted or leave the island. There was exactly 1 day a year when you were legally allowed to change your contract, switch employers, or push back on your conditions. That 1 day was October the 1st, and it was called Contract Day. For 30 straight years, that single day was the only pressure valve on this entire system. 364 days of fixed wages with zero leverage, and 1 day where, in theory, workers had a voice. But by 1878, that theory had worn very thin. So when the rumor about Henry Trotman swept through the Contract Day crowd, it didn't create the anger that followed. It simply gave 30 years of built-up anger somewhere to go. And there's a part of this story that is very often overlooked, even within the Caribbean. The uprising had 4 leaders, and all 4 of them were women. The first was Mary Thomas. Everyone came to call her Queen Mary, though she herself preferred to be called Captain. She had come to St. Croix from the nearby island of Antigua as a young woman looking for work, and by 1878, she was living and laboring at a plantation called Estate Spratt Hall. She was about 40 years old by then and had 3 children. Of the 4 women in this story, she's the one whose name survived best over time. There's a folk song about her still sung on St. Croix today in the local Creole. The second woman was Axeline Salomon, known as Queen Agnes. She lived in Estate Bethlehem and was especially active organizing workers in the southern part of the island. She was in her early 20s and also raising 3 children. Then there's the third woman named Matilda McBean, known as Queen Matilda, who lived at Estate Kane, which is about what we know about her. And there was a fourth woman. Her name is Susanna Abrahamson, and people knew her by the nickname Bottom Belly, though I'm not sure exactly why. She lived and worked at Estate Prosperity. She was the oldest of the 4, around 48, and raising 9 children. These 4 women led the uprising, and once it was finally put down, all 4 of them were arrested, all 4 of them stood trial, and all 4 of them were sentenced to death. However, none of them were executed. 12 men involved in the uprising were shot by firing squad, and the number of women who took part but never became queens in anyone's memory were burned. These men and women deserve this mention as much as the 4 we still remember. Mary, Agnes, Matilda, and Susanna were spared that fate. Their death sentences were commuted, and what happened to them instead was its own kind of extraordinary. They were put on a ship called the Thea and sent across the Atlantic Ocean to Denmark itself. They arrived in Copenhagen in 1882, and they were imprisoned in the women's prison in Christianshavn. Inside the prison where the 4 women were incarcerated, inmates were sorted into what some have described as a Danish system called classes of constraint. The lowest class meant no education and no access to even the Bible. The second class allowed you to write letters and receive visitors. And the third class allowed you to wear your own clothes instead of a prison uniform. You moved up or down depending on how you behaved. And we know these 4 women moved through that system because letters they wrote are proof of it. Susanna was the first to go home. She arrived back on St. Croix in 1886, ahead of the other 3. Mary Agnes and Matilda followed roughly a year later, all of them finally crossing back over the Atlantic to the town of Frederiksted to finish out what remained of their sentences on the same island they'd set on fire 9 years earlier. Mary Thomas died in 1905. What became of Agnes, Matilda, and Susanna isn't well documented anywhere I could find. What's interesting is that for most of the last 150 years, If you had asked someone in the Virgin Islands about this uprising, you would probably have heard about 3 queens and not 4. A bronze statue even went up on the neighboring island of St. Thomas showing 3 women. A highway on St. Croix itself got named Queen Mary Highway after only one of them. Susanna Abrahamson isn't in those stories at all. That only changed in 2004 when a historian named Wayne James went digging through old Danish colonial archives and found her. He found documents and photographs of the women's prison where all 4 of them were eventually sent. We don't fully know why she dropped out of memory while the other 3 didn't. It might simply be about which names got repeated first and which one got left off after that. We just don't know that for certain. In 2018, on the 100th anniversary of Denmark handing these islands over to the United States, 2 artists, one from St. Croix and one Danish Trinidadian, unveiled a statue in the Copenhagen harbor. The statue is of Queen Mary, 7 meters tall, sitting on a wicker throne looking out over the water. It was the first public monument to a black woman that Denmark had ever erected. Then, in December 2020, a winter storm tore the statue apart. It had been built from lightweight material, not bronze, and it couldn't survive Danish weather any better than the thin freedom Denmark once granted an island full of people. The site where she once sat is empty right now, waiting on a permanent bronze version that still hasn't been finished. Hopefully, Queen Mary will find her place again, so she can look over the sea at all that's going on.